In this video, we're going to learn about what causes cancer and what we can do to reduce our risk. So remember, cancer is caused by the accumulation of mutations in 6 to 10 genes that regulate the cell cycle. Which regulator genes are mutated will be unique for each patient. So in this picture here, you can see that 4 or more mutations are accumulating to cause these cells to become malignant or cancerous. Somatic mutations contribute to all cancers. So those are mutations that occur in body cells. And that happens whether the cancer is inherited or sporadic. So just to review, remember, an inherited cancer means in the egg or a sperm, a mutation was brought when the offspring was formed. And so every cell in that individual's body contains that mutation that they inherited. Sporadic cancer, on the other hand, is mutations that accumulate over time within those body cells. Now, inherited cancer, you get one mutation to start off with, and you have to accumulate more. With sporadic cancer, you're starting with no mutations, and you have to accumulate those mutations over time. Now, these mutations, these somatic mutations, are caused by either mistakes in DNA replication, which is something that you can't help, or DNA damage due to environmental exposures. And that is something you can try to limit to reduce your risk. So let's take a look at mistakes in DNA replication. So DNA polymerase, when it is copying DNA, sometimes will make a mismatch. So for example, we have a T paired with a G, which is not normally what happens. And then when DNA replication occurs, notice that our new strand down here now has been copied, okay? And that T is now paired with an A, and we have a different set of base pairs there where we should see a G and a C. So now we've created this mutation, and it's going to be passed on to future cells. So if the mistake happens before mitosis in a body cell, so when DNA replication occurs, so a somatic mutation, then the newly created cells will have that mutation, as we can see here. If the mistake happens when making an egg or a sperm, that's a germline mutation, and that mutation will be passed on to the next generation and could lead to inherited cancer. So there are a variety of different genes that have mutations that have been shown to be inherited and increase one's risk of developing cancer. So inheriting a germline mutation acts as a risk factor for developing cancer by reducing the number of somatic mutations needed to develop cancer. If you inherit a mutated cancer gene, then you are one step closer to developing cancer. Examples of these include the BRCA1 and 2, which are associated with breast and ovarian cancer. Okay. Another one we will talk about in this class is going to be inherited mutations in P53, okay, which is called Li-Fraumeni syndrome, and that leads to a variety of different cancers, including breast cancer, sarcomas, leukemias, and brain cancer, so a variety of different ones. But there are quite a few inherited mutations that can increase your risk. But again, it's just one step closer. It's not a guarantee. So besides mistakes to DNA replication, DNA damage can also be due to environmental exposure. So here we can see there's a variety of environmental exposures, including UV light, chemical exposure, radiation, things like that. And I just wanted to remind you guys that when we have DNA damage, the cell's going to do everything it can to fix it. Whether it was mistakes in replication like we see here, DNA polymerase has a proofreading mechanism. But if it misses that mistake, or if the DNA is physically damaged, you will see that mechanisms kick in, like DNA repair mechanisms, or triggering apoptosis if there's a lot of DNA damage, checkpoints, okay? So there are all these things in place to try to reduce the risk of having cancer. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about behaviors that these environmental effects that can increase your risk. And let's try to figure out how we can reduce that. So 40% of cancer cases can be prevented. And they are mainly due to kind of bad behaviors. So things such as smoking, obesity, alcohol consumption, exposure to UV radiation, so that's sunlight, lack of physical activity, and a poor diet. All of these behaviors increase your risk because they can all lead to DNA damage. So let's look at smoking first. Cigarette smoking can affect pretty much anywhere in your body. Usually you just think of it as associated with lungs, as you can see down here. But smoking can cause cancer because when you smoke, whether it's cigarette smoke or pot or vaping, whenever you're putting chemicals into your lungs, they could potentially enter your bloodstream. And when they enter your bloodstream, they can then damage your DNA. Damaged DNA can result in incorrect proteins being made and the cell cycle not being regulated correctly. If the cell goes to repair the fix, it might make a mutation in the repair process. So either way, you're going to end up with potential DNA damage, and over time, the accumulation of those mutations can lead to cancer. So smoking increases your risk. Smoking does not guarantee you'll get cancer. In fact, only about 1 out of 10 smokers develop cancer, but you're putting yourself at risk because you're damaging your DNA and making yourself one step closer to developing cancer. So here I want to also point out, here's a healthy lung on the left and a smoker's lung on the right. You can see how blackened and damaged it is. Keep in mind, whenever you put something in your body that causes DNA damage, cellular repair is going to have to happen. So in order to replace those damaged and dying cells, your body has to copy the DNA so it can make new cells. But every time you copy DNA, you can't help it, but there are potential mistakes to DNA replication that can occur. And so mutations can accumulate over time. So all of these risk factors we're going to talk about are just that, risk factors. Okay, they increase your chances of developing mutation. They're not a guarantee. Just like inheriting a mutation doesn't guarantee you're going to develop cancer, but it increases your risk. Another thing that can increase your risk is being overweight. So you have special cells in your body called adipose tissue or fat cells. And fat cells actually can make their own hormones and growth factors. So estrogen is a hormone that is made actually by fat. And we've learned that hormones and growth factors can go tell cells that it's time to divide. And so if the cells that are around happen to be a cancer cell and they're receiving increased growth factors and hormones, that's going to give basically those cancer cells more reasons to divide, and you can form a tumor. So because estrogen is one of the hormones that is produced by fat cells, we see breast cancer and uterine cancer being common with increased obesity. Now, you can decrease your chances of being obese by eating a proper diet and doing some other things such as exercising more. Now, let's talk a little bit about diet and exercise, because not only does a good diet decrease your risk of obesity, but a good diet can also help prevent cancer. So eating more fruits and vegetables can decrease your risk of developing cancer because, one, fruits and vegetables contain these things called phytonutrients. And these phytonutrients work with your cells to carry out certain processes, such as reducing chronic inflammation. If you remember, we talked about the fact that cancer is like a wound that doesn't heal. When an area is inflamed, it swells, more blood is brought to the area, And that means more white blood cells come to the area to try to repair it. And in the process of repairing, growth factors get released, which can then cause tumors to grow even more. So by eating fruits and vegetables, they have a lot of things called antioxidants, which reduce inflammation, and they also help neutralize DNA damaging free radicals. So both of those things reduce your risk of developing mutations and therefore cancer. Also, vitamins such as vitamin C and things like that can promote immune system function, and the more functioning your immune system is, the more likely it is to then be able to attack cancer cells if they exist. It is also recommended that you eat less meat and less processed meat in order to reduce your cancer risk. So it has been found that processed meat, especially those that contain nitrates like salami, sausages and hot dogs, and bacon, they have a high classification as a cause of cancer. Okay, the nitrates in those products damage DNA. And so it's important to reduce your consumption of those things. You can look also for things like nitrate-free bacon and stuff like that to help reduce your risk if you want to eat these processed meats. Also, red meat tends to be higher in fat, which can lead to obesity. And those, you can see that when you have increased meat consumption, it can lead to things like colorectal cancer, prostate cancer, and breast cancer. So again, smoking is going to have a much bigger risk involved than, say, eating meat. But if you wanted to reduce your risk, eating less meat or eating meat in moderation is going to be one of those things that over time is going to decrease your DNA damage. Another thing about your diet is alcohol consumption. Alcohol can lead to cancer, and that basically has to do with the fact that alcohol, so ethanol or ethyl alcohol, gets converted to acetaldehyde in your body. And acetaldehyde causes DNA damage. It can lead to mistakes in DNA. It can lead to breaks in your DNA and then causing them to kind of rearrange. It also causes DNA to bind together and clump, making it more difficult to separate. Okay, so this acetaldehyde, if you drink too much, will build up in your body and lead to DNA damage. Now, this is kind of a striking thing. So drinking a bottle of wine over the course of a week, okay, so that's maybe having like 3 or 4 alcoholic beverages a week, is the equivalent of smoking several cigarettes. So it does have DNA damage, not as much as, say, actual smoking, but it does increase your risk. So let's talk about other environmental factors that can cause DNA damage. Radiation is one of them. So there's a variety of different sources of radiation, such as X-rays or UV light. X-rays and gamma rays, they will actually physically break the DNA. So you can see single-stranded breaks or double-stranded breaks in the DNA. Something like UV light causes strange binding to occur. So normally, if you have a thymine and an adenine across from each other, they bind to each other. But UV light forms these things called thymine dimers. And thymine dimers are when 2 neighboring thymines bond together. And as a result, instead of having a nice linear DNA molecule, when you have a thymine dimer, you get a bump. Okay, and that bump messes with the enzymes that are trying to work on the DNA molecule. So both cases, whether it's a bump in your DNA or a break in your DNA, radiation physically damages the DNA, and that makes it difficult for enzymes to properly carry out transcription and replication. Cells try to fix the DNA damage, but they may make mistakes or mutations in the repair process, and that can lead to the development of cancer-causing mutations. If DNA damage is extensive, it can lead to cell death. So we've talked about this before, like at the G1 checkpoint or the G2 checkpoint. If cell damage or DNA damage is so extensive, it'll trigger apoptosis. and that'll cause the cells to die. Scientists have taken advantage of that, and that's why they actually use radiation treatment to try to kill cancer cells. The scientists think that if they expose a tumor to enough enough radiation, that it'll trigger so much DNA damage that the cell will eventually die. Okay, so that's how radiation treatments work. However, in the process, you also are exposing healthy cells to radiation. So although it may be killing a tumor that you have right now, it could potentially be causing DNA damage that could lead to tumors further down the road. The last piece we're going to talk about are infections. So both bacteria and viruses can lead to the development of cancer. And here are some examples. Up top, we see there are different types of viruses. Hepatitis B and hepatitis C, they increase your chances of liver cancer. And we're going to spend some time talking about HPV, or human papillomavirus, which can lead to cervical cancer and prostate cancer and things like that. There are also some bacteria infections that can increase your risk of developing cancer. So there is bacteria that's found in some people's guts, H. pylori bacteria, that leads to ulcers. And because ulcers are wounds, those wounds have to repair, and so mistakes get made in the repair process, and that can lead to stomach cancer. Okay. And tuberculosis, which is another bacteria, an infection of tuberculosis, damages lung tissue. In the process of repairing that tissue, you might end up having mutations, which can lead to lung cancer. So we see that illnesses can lead to cancer further down the line. And let's talk about why. When you have an infection, whether it's bacterial infection or a viral infection, you're going to see an increase in inflammation. And inflammation, like we've mentioned before, feeds tumors, okay? Inflamed tissue brings white blood cells to the area. They produce growth factors to try to repair the tissue, and that leads, those growth factors trigger cancer cells in the area to divide more. Also, your immune system is needed to help fight cancer. You need macrophages and T cells to help fight off cancer cells. And so if you have an infection, you could potentially decrease your immune function, and that could leave you at risk. And then the final thing is with viruses. So viruses are interesting in that they take over their host cell and turn them into virus-making factories. And in order to do that, there's viral DNA integration. And when the DNA gets integrated into its host cell, it can basically land in the middle of a gene and shut off that gene. And we see that with tumor suppressor genes being inactivated or proto-oncogenes being hyperactive as a result of virus infection. So let's take a look at cervical cancer, and let's look at HPV in more detail. So this is HPV right here. Okay. And what happens, we're going to focus on cervical cancer, but HPV there are lots of different forms of it. It can also be infecting, basically it affects epithelial cells. So it can affect the lining throughout your body. So different viruses affect different linings. So we're going to focus on the type of HPV that causes cervical cancer, but there's also HPV that will infect your skin and lead to warts. There's HPV that can infect your throat and lead to throat lesions and throat cancer later on. But right now we're looking at cervical cancer. Okay, so cervical cancer, the cervix is kind of the opening or the leading into the uterus. Okay, and so it's surrounded by this layer of tissue called epithelial tissue. And HPV can get into the layer of epithelial tissue. Specifically, if there's a cut, so you can see there's almost like a little crack there, the virus can get down and it can get into the very bottom cells of the epithelial, which are called the basal cells. And those are important because basal cells are the stem cells. They are the ones that divide to make new epithelial cells because the woman's internal environment is exposed and those epithelial cells can get damaged and things like that, and they need to be replaced. So that's what the basal cells do. Now, these basal cells reproduce a lot to make new replacement epithelial cells. So HPV infection can actually last about 2 years. Okay, this virus is going to turn these epithelial cells into virus-making factories and kind of spread, and it forms almost like a lesion on the cervix. Okay, and so eventually the immune system and things like that will destroy the virus and cause the cells to go back to normal. However, during that infection process, we can see that HPV is integrated into the tumor cell. So you guys see that little red line? That's supposed to represent this red DNA inside the virus. Okay? So the virus DNA ends up inside the host cell's DNA, and it lands right in the middle of a gene. In HPV, it often lands right in the middle of P53, our guardian of the genome. And when it lands in the middle of it, it disrupts the code, which basically means the cell can't make P53 properly. And we know P53 is a really important tumor suppressor gene. Okay? It stops cells at checkpoints, it repairs DNA, it triggers apoptosis. So without this tumor suppressor gene working, more mutations accumulate over time. And so we can see that we almost accelerate the progress of getting cancer and of developing invasive cancer. So over time, again, not a fast process, 10 to 30 years, that infection may lead to increases in mutations, which can then cause the cells to become cancerous. So you can't always help developing cancer, right? Mistakes in DNA happen. And that's why cancer tends to be a disease of old age. You just accumulate mistakes over time. But you can reduce your risk of DNA damage by choosing good behaviors. Things like not smoking and not being around others who are smoking, whether it's cigarette smoke, pot, or vaping. All of those chemicals can get into your lungs and damage the cells. You should work to keep a healthy weight by staying active and exercising, eat lots of fruits and vegetables, and avoiding alcohol. You should also avoid your exposure to radiation, whether it's from the sun or sources such as X-rays and things like that. Okay, avoid contact with pollutants, things in your environment. There are chemicals in your environment that can damage your DNA when you breathe them in or when you take them in your food or in your skin. So that's important. And then most importantly, take care of yourself, okay? As a woman, you should be getting screenings for cervical cancer, so getting pap smears done, okay? You should make sure that you get appropriate vaccinations. So as you can see here, there are vaccines that can actually prevent cancer. So being vaccinated against hepatitis, being vaccinated against HPV, all of those things will help reduce the risk of infection that could lead to cancer down the road. Now, let's make smart choices so that we can all reduce our risk of getting cancer and we can reduce and help fight this horrible disease.